Oh, I don't know that I would say that. Thank you. Morning. Good to see everybody this morning. Some faces we've been missing due to illness. Very happy to have them back and looking good. And I wasn't expecting Travis and Joanne. I just assumed you'd still be out in the winter wonderland of Colorado. So it's good to have them back with us this morning. We are going to look at Ruth, and I'll start this. We'll look at chapter 1 and chapter 2. I hope we can get through chapter 1 and chapter 2 this morning. It's just 2 chapters, but there is so much to talk about with Ruth that it can easily be a challenge for me. Most of these are a challenge for me. Just an introduction to the book of Ruth. Historical background. You'll find Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1 indicates that this was during the time of the judges. Now, we just finished looking at the judges. What can you tell me about the time of the judges? What's one of the key phrases that's repeated over and over again? Yes, we saw Israel consistently turn away from God to chase after their fleshly desires, turning to idols, people of the land that they were supposed to have driven out. And because of that, God allowed them to be taken captive, for the land to be dominated by other nations that they failed to drive out. It seems that during that time that nobody looked to God and the things of God. Ruth is a contrast to that. In Judges, we look at the nation from a high level as a nation. But in Ruth, the book of Ruth, we see the story of a family during that time impacted by the adverse conditions, choices they made, and the consequences of many of those choices. But it is a redeeming story, whereas Judges is full of gloom and doom. Ruth is a book of hope. It's a wonderful study to go into the book of Ruth and take a look at God's providence and His protection of His people, what God will do. At the time of the writing of Ruth, there's famine in the land. It may very well, we don't know for sure, but it may very well refer to the Midianite oppression, which is recorded in Judges 3 through chapter 6, verses 3 through 6 talks about it. If so, that would have been during the time of Gideon, who was the judge that was raised up to deliver them from those years of oppression. That would have placed it in possibly the middle of the 12th century BC. Also, in the old Jewish canon, the two were actually considered one book, Judges and Ruth. It was only later that they were split into 2 books. And you can see, again, a big distinction between the two. Ruth, the book of Ruth, is one of 2 books that were named after a woman. What's the other one? Esther. What's unique about Ruth as opposed to Esther? Esther was royalty, and she was a Jew. Ruth, on the other hand, she was a Moabite. She wasn't even a Hebrew child. She wasn't of the lineage, and yet she has a book named after her. Authorship. There's nothing to identify who the author was. There's some thought that it may have been Samuel, maybe Hezekiah or Ezra, for Judges and also for Ruth. However, with that said, there are pieces within the book that clearly capture information that's further down the road. So if it was written by one of those 3, somebody else added some information to the book, which does not make it not inspired of God. We have other books that were written by multiple individuals. Name a couple. Psalms. Psalms was contributed to by several different individuals, and another one would be the Proverbs. So it has nothing to do, it's God-inspired, it's God packaged, I guess I'd say. What's the purpose of the book of Ruth? What do we get out of it? Principle of the kinsman redeemer, which is key, which somebody's going to talk about next week. We'll allude to it. We'll start it. But then next week, somebody's going to talk about it. So, I'm not sure we know who yet. There is some discussion. The book of Ruth gives a critical link to the ancestry of King David, because Boaz, Boaz, who's one of the main characters of the book, who was his father and mother? Salmon was the father, and somebody we studied about in Joshua lived in the city of Jericho. Rahab was his mother. Also, not a Jew, but a Gentile. In the lineage of King David and his greater son, who is David's greater son, Jesus Christ. His greater son, Jesus Christ. Lineage of Jesus Christ. And you'll find that captured in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. The book of Ruth provides important lessons on the sovereignty and the providence of God. You will see in Ruth God's intervention with man in providing for his ultimate plan and purpose and providing for his children. The divine purpose is fulfilled despite all that occurred to Naomi and her family. And if I get through this, we'll get into the actual events here. It's already been mentioned. It provides an example of the rule of the kinsman redeemer, which foreshadows who as our kinsman redeemer? Jesus Christ. So it's a very important concept for us to understand. Contrast between the books of Judges and Ruth. And I'll note these real quickly, and then we'll move on. Judges is a lesson on the consequences of Israel, God's people turning to false idols, while Ruth is a warming story of a Gentile woman turning from the false idols of her people to love and serve the true God of heaven. Judges is a picture of the results of following man's ideals, while Ruth depicts the results of allowing God to guide our lives. That's important for us today. Too oftentimes, we want to follow after the world in the world's ideals. But if we'll follow after God's plan for our life, we'll find that our life is a happy life. Won't be without problems. How many have lived their lives without any problems since you've been saved? But God will provide for us, take care of us, and we'll have a happy life in Him. The book of Judges focuses on God's dealing with a rebellious nation, while Ruth is an intimate focus on God's love and providence for all who seek Him. I cannot overemphasize, I have this in bold, I cannot overemphasize the significance of this. God wants to have a personal, intimate relationship with each of us, with me, and with you today. He loves you, and He wants only the best for you if you will yield to His will in your life, and that's the key. Too oftentimes, we decide, I know best, and I'm going to do this. And we go against the will of God, and it only leads to problems similar to those that we saw in Judges, and we'll actually see in the early parts of Ruth. as we look at it this morning. All right, before we get started, any comments or any questions, any thoughts? Okay. Would somebody go ahead and read the first 17 verses of Ruth chapter 1? Anybody? Okay, so as we go back and we take a look at this, beginning verse 1, came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, so we have our setting. There was a famine in the land. Again, I mentioned this very well may have been recorded or this time may have been recorded in Judges chapter 6, the time of Gideon. There was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah. Bethlehem, Judah indicates it was within the tribe of Judah, that area, and the city Bethlehem. Euphrates is mentioned later on. That was the name of the city prior to it being renamed Bethlehem when the Jews went in and took it. Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Why did they go to the country of Moab? There was a famine in the land. He, his wife, and his 2 sons left to go to Moab. What are your thoughts of that? Open it up for some discussion. What did he leave behind? His heritage? His inheritance? God had brought them out of Egypt into a land promised unto them. And God had promised to provide for them. Now, certainly, a famine. Have you ever faced tough times in your family? How do you deal with them? How should we deal with them? We should trust in the Lord. The Lord delivered them there. Do you really think that the Lord told him to take his family out of the Hebrew nation into an idolatrous land to mix with the people? No. So, all indication, I believe firmly that Elimelech made a decision on his own against the will of God. Now, what are the consequences? Verse 2, and the name of the man was Elimelech, the name of the woman, Naomi. Now, Naomi, the wife, would have gone because her husband went, certainly, and they took their children because their husband led them. They came into the country Moab and continued there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. Now, this is the mother, 2 sons, father's gone. That's a tough situation, especially back in that time. Not only that, verse 4 says, and they, the 2 sons, took them wives of the women of Moab. The women of Moab would have been what? Idolatrous. Idolatrous women. The 2 sons are named. They took them women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelled there about 10 years. So Naomi had provision through her sons. Her sons were responsible for caring for the family since the father was gone. They stayed there for 10 years, but then what happened? Verse 5 says, Mahlon and Chilion died, also both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. What's the problem now? I'm sorry? And in that case, what's their provision? There is no provision. Why did this happen to the family? Go back to the original decision of father. Who is responsible in the family for the family? The father. And the father will be judged. When I either pass on or the Lord comes and takes me away, I'm going to be judged on the decisions I made for my family. According to what? God. Not on whether I gave them a easy life, a life of substance, material. It's not based on material things. But too oftentimes, we as fathers, what do we focus on? Material things. And we, like Elimelech, lead our family away from God and away from the will of God. And then we scratch our heads and wonder why things are the way they are. There's a huge responsibility on fathers today to lead their families by example, to give them the proper upbringing so that they will follow in the steps of God as He leads them. Nothing? Oh, clearing your voice. Yeah. Why do you think that happened? Because their upbringing. Again, it goes back to the father. Now, don't misunderstand me. When children leave home and start to make their own decisions, they're responsible for the decisions they make. They can no longer point back to the parents and say, it's your fault. Because now they're making their own decisions. It's their responsibility. But in that time that they are under your roof, you have a responsibility. They need to be, God would have them to be in their life. As a child of God, it's your responsibility to make sure that they are raised up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So, not only that, so these two sons married Moabite women. What had God commanded the children of Israel about it? Not to be unequally yoked. That's how the New Testament terms it, but in Leviticus and repeated in Deuteronomy, they were instructed not to marry. And in fact, in Joshua's day, and we studied it, 24,000 Jewish men, lost their life through plague by the hand of God because they married strange women. Guess what nation they were of? The Moabites. The Moabites. Most people today would have praised Elimelech for uprooting his family and going to find another job to provide for his family. But you see in the example the consequences of it. It wasn't God's will. I don't believe it was God's will. I'll just state it that way. Yeah. 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 Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Well, and what was the problem? Why was Israel going through the famine? Because they were disobeying God in the very first place. All right. So we see some of these early problems within the family of Elimelech. The problem is God has promised to provide for his people, for you and I. Even through the tough times, he's promised to provide for us if we will obey him. And that's the problem we have in our lives. Decide we're not going to follow, we're not going to obey, and God will not bless us in our disobedience. Instead, we often rob God of our time, our worship, our service, our prayers, and our substance. And as you look on your life, as I look on my life, I see many times where I have been guilty of robbing God of those things that are rightfully his. We go on. So his sons married Moabite women. They became unequally yoked. The Moabites worshiped the idol Chemosh, which is referred to in 1 Kings 11:7 as the abomination of Moab. Eventually, it led to Naomi and her daughter-in-laws becoming destitute in a foreign land after Naomi's sons died. There they were with no means of provision, foreign land, away from all of their family, all of the promises of God. That was the result of Elimelech's decisions. We as husbands, as fathers, oftentimes are guilty of making similar decisions in our own life. There is. Is that not a problem that we have in many of our churches today, where the men decide not to follow. They decide, I've got other things, I've got more important things, and they leave, the whole family and the church. The duties of the church then have to be picked up by the women, instead of men stepping up as fathers and husbands and doing what's right before God. Too oftentimes are churches, when you look out, you'll find that it's mainly made up of women. Even here, there's a lot of services that we have where by far the majority is the women. And I praise the women and also those who will stand and do as they should, men and women. But again, we men, and I'm going to get off of this in a second, we men have a responsibility to lead our family by teaching and by example. That means that we need to be where we ought to be. And we're going to get into what Brother Evans was talking about. He left him destitute. Verse 6, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem, her home, when she heard how the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Now, what seems to be the motivation there? Yeah, it was the physical welfare. That's what's noted. The bread. In other words, the famine was over. What should have been, now it may have been there, but it's not stated here. What should have been there? The desire to return to her people and her God, and the God that gave them the promises and the blessings. Now, again, this is what's stated, is that she heard that the famine was over, and there was once again bread in the land. Another concern that I have, verse 8, Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. Now, what's she telling these 2 Moabitish women to do? Go back to their family and to their way of life. Now, what's the reason behind that? There is a reason behind it. And again, the world would look at it and say, that's admirable. What's the reason behind it? As young widows, they could go back home and do what? Remarry and have a family and be provided for. What was the problem with Naomi and following after Naomi? Naomi was an elderly woman by this time, had no means of providing. Going back to the land, she saw no real future for herself, and so she instructs them, go back to what? What was in the land? Idolatry. Idolatry. Again, from a physical standpoint, you would say that's to their benefit. But from a spiritual standpoint, what was the better? Well, I think we'll see when the 2 young women make their choices. Now, again, going back, I want to be careful and not too harsh on Naomi. Why? Because she has taught them. Ruth, certainly, and both of them. Yeah. Both of the young women were with Naomi through that time in Moab. Both of them saw the same examples, heard the same words. Orpah, eventually, as we get there, decides, I'm going to go back to my old ways. I will worship as my people did. Whereas Ruth says, I will go. And again, we're jumping ahead a little bit. She says, verse 8, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you. What's that? The Lord deal kindly with you. What Lord? Jehovah. She is calling out the blessings of the true God of heaven in them going back to their old ways. The Lord grant you, verse 9, the Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. That is not unlike us today. What do we look for our children? We want them to we want them to prosper. But too oftentimes, we define prospering in material, earthly, fleshly ways instead of in the ways of God. What is prospering for a Christian? Being in the will of God. Following after the will of God. Not chasing after the world. I don't care if you turn out to be a billionaire. If that's what you're after, more power to you. If that's what you're chasing, you'll lose the rewards that God has set aside for you in heaven. Or you can chase after the things of God, and God will bless you in this life. Now, you may be the beggar at the feet of the table, or you may be the master in a large house. But your attitude for chasing material things versus the things of God will determine how God deals with you. You can have all the money in the world and your life is full of problems and trouble. Not happy, not joyful. We need to evaluate those things we chase after. In my lifetime, decisions that I made, I should have done a better job in evaluating. Verse 10, and they said unto her, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. The daughters initially showed a desire to follow with their mother-in-law. Naomi, verse 11, said, turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. What's Naomi talking about? Husband and having sons and daughters waiting. What is this? What was part of, what do I say, the law, the tradition of the Jews? If there were other sons in the house, yeah. Can you give me an example? You go back to Judah. Judah had sons. And the eldest son married a woman and died. And what was supposed to happen? The next son was supposed to marry. He refused. And what happened? God took his life. And the next one, same thing. Eventually, what happened with the wife of the eldest son? She had a child of Judah, her father-in-law. All right. That's what she's talking about, is the responsibility of the son. So she says, even if I were married today and had sons, you'd have to wait all this time. Would you really wait for my sons 20 years? They lifted up their voice. They wept again. Orpah made her decision, which was to go back. Ruth made her decision. Her decision, I think this is some of the prettiest, this is used oftentimes at weddings, songs. Verse 15, and she said, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back, this is Naomi, unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. What is this that Ruth has said? She says, I'm not going to leave you. But in addition to that, she makes a commitment to God. Now, I don't know at what point in her life that Ruth placed her faith and trust in Jehovah, God of the Jews, God of the Israelites. But there is a profession of her faith. Thy God will be my God. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. She makes in her statement here a strong commitment. Be ye steadfast is how it's termed in the New Testament. We are to be steadfast in our commitment to God, not wavering, not shaken by the storms of life, but completely and fully given over to the God of heaven. Catch up in my notes. Oftentimes, when we have those hard times, what do? We sort of crumble. We start to turn to, what do I need to do to make this situation better? When what we should be doing is what? Looking to the Lord, turning it over to Him. Hebrews chapter 10, 23 through 25. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promised. Does that not apply to this lesson this morning? He's faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. Let us, who's this being written to? God's people. God's people, the Hebrews. Let us, as you and I today, let us, it is my responsibility to provoke, to encourage. Who else's responsibility is it? It's yours. Too oftentimes, encouragement and edification is one direction. Too many times there are people of God, Christians, who fail to follow this part of the instruction to provoke others. How do we provoke others to love and good works? We start by example. It's by encouragement. It's by prayer. We need to be on our knees praying for one another, remembering one another, considering one another, not once in a blue moon, but constantly. How is our prayer life? Do you pray for the individuals sitting? Maybe y'all pray for this section because you like this section. And maybe y'all pray for this section, and y'all pray for that section, and y'all over there for that section. It's not how it works. We should pray for every one of our congregation, but not just our congregation, but for other congregations, those that serve the true and living God, those that follow after His New Testament word. We should pray for the missionaries on the field. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together. There is nothing more discouraging than walking into the church building and looking around and it's half empty. And as you look, you see, well, John Doe sits there normally, but he's not here. It's discouraging. It's not encouraging. It's important that we show up, that we began with our presence and our participation. But our service is performed where? Out there. And there's no way of hiding it. When we do God's will in our lives, others will see results, even if they're not walking with us. They'll see it in us and how God impacts us in the way we walk and we talk. When we're serving God, are we doing this about that section? Or about that section? No. Our focus is on edifying and building up, provoking each other to do good works, not forsaking the assembling ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. We go on. Verse 20. Naomi says, call me not Naomi. This is upon their return back to Bethlehem, their hometown. When the other women of the town see her, say, is this Naomi? What does she say? Call me not Naomi. What does Naomi mean? Pleasant. Call me Mara. What does Mara mean? Bitter. Why bitter? Yeah. And in fact, she attributes it to the Lord. I can only assume she did some self-assessment of the decisions of Elimelech and herself and the family and their choices. And she says, for the Lord hath dealt bitterly with me. Why would the Lord deal bitterly with her? Yeah. Took them out of church. They decided other things were more important. I say church. That's for us today. Instead of participating here, they're participating everywhere else, and their time is out there devoted to other things. Verse 21, I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? That indicates to me she recognized what the problem was. She identified it. Went out full. We thought it was a good idea, but we went without the Lord. The children of Israel went into battle several times. They went up against the little outpost Ai. What was the problem? Had sin in the camp. They weren't following the will of God. And they suffered the consequences of it. Many other times, we see the consequences of not following God. We think it's a good idea. We think it's easy. I've got this. I got this. Yeah. I don't have to bother God. She went out full. She came back empty. Verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Now, that's chapter 1. 3 minutes. Chapter 2. What is gleaning? Harvesting. So, gleaning in the harvest, so the farmer harvests the crops, and what did the law tell the Israelites to do? Leave behind. And don't go back and re-harvest. So what's been left? What's fallen to the ground? Don't go back and gather it. For what purpose? For the poor. That's right. You'll find that in Leviticus 19, 9, and 10. Deuteronomy 24, 19 repeats it. It was for the poor and the strangers in the land, so that there was provision for them. They didn't get state handouts. It was work. They had to go and do. The scriptures are very clear that those who do not work do not eat. When individuals are unwilling, now, I want to be careful, again, there are some individuals that are very limited in what they can do. We are given instruction in the New Testament to provide for those that cannot provide for themselves, including the elderly women. Now, what about the younger women, widows? The elder. We are instructed to provide for the elderly widows. What about the younger widows? What do they say? Get married. Get married. Now, that sounds chauvinistic. It's not today's. God understands and provides. He has a plan. We don't want to follow it. Okay, I could go down a lot of rabbit holes there. We'll just move on. This was provided for those who were poor and had no other means. And so Ruth tells Naomi, I will go and glean in the fields. What happens just by happenstance, by circumstance? Boaz, near kinsman, she winds up in his fields. Now that was circumstance as far as Ruth. She didn't know whose fields it was, but it was not circumstance in God's sight. God provided. And you'll see that as you continue on, God works his plan and provides for Naomi and Ruth. I agree. I think in Elimelech's disobedience that God still worked his plan as he would. I look at it very similarly to Joseph being sold into Egyptian bondage. Was that God's plan? I don't think so. I think God had promised the land to Abraham and his descendants, and they weren't supposed to go into Egypt, but they did. And God still worked his plan. You're not going to alter God's plan. What you will alter is whether you're going to be a part of God's plan and whether you will receive the blessings, both in this life and in the life to come, for serving the true and living and sovereign and almighty God of heaven. Make your choice. Make your choice. Too many times in my life, I've made the wrong choice. Make your choice. Who will you serve? God or man? Any other comments, thoughts, or questions?